evening, everybody, or good afternoon, good morning, and good night if you are listening to the recording. The purpose of this is just to run very rapidly through Porter's 5 forces. I don't particularly want to recreate the on-campus sort of lecture mode, since our program designers put a lot of time and effort into translating the on-campus course into the Swinburne online mode, which is what thus all the learning materials, the discussion board, the readings, all cover everything that you would cover excuse me, on the on campus. So however, I did get a positive review on my efforts with Pestel, so thank you for that. And even if one person appreciates this extra stuff, I'll do it. So here we are, and I think it was Sharon who said she found the last one useful. So let's take a quick run through Porter's 5 forces. All right, well, first of all, it forms part of an industrial organization view, which is, remember, the sole purpose of strategic management is to gain competitive advantage. And this is an approach to competitive advantage that advocates that external industry forces are more important than internal factors for achieving competitive advantage. So you could say that Michael Porter is a proponent of the IO, or industrial organization view. And they believe, and their work seems to show, that organizational performance will primarily be determined by industry factors, not what you're doing inside the firm, which is quite interesting. And Porter's 5 forces model is an example of this, and it analyzes the forces that can be applied from outside and how you can use those forces to gain and keep competitive advantage. And it's largely determined by positioning within an industry, according to advocates. So if you want to manage strategically from the industrial organization, or IO, I'll say from now on, perspective, it means you have to strive to compete in attractive industries. So, if you're going into horse and carriages at this stage, or something silly like that, you're not going to have a great deal of success. So you look for attractive industries, and that, of course, raises the question of what's an attractive industry. You avoid weak or faltering ones, so don't go into them at all, and also try and get a full understanding of the key external factor relationships within that attractive industry that you have decided it would be worth getting into for competitive advantage reasons. So the aim of the industry analysis is to answer these questions. What is the current absolute and relative profitability of this industry? And what is the expected future profitability of this industry? Excuse me. And an industry is most likely to be profitable when certain conditions apply. And these conditions will be things like entry is difficult. There are many small suppliers whose contribution is unimportant. There are many small buyers. There are few substitutes, and those of you who've done economics will find yourself in familiar territory with things like substitutes. And there are few relatively happy competitors, which is as opposed to millions of, bitterly unhappy competitive competitors. So those are the things one should seek out. All right, well, Porter's 5 forces analysis is used to determine those factors that affect the profitability of an industry. And it's a widely used approach. And according to Porter, and you've all probably read the nice article which is included in your learning materials, which is all you really have to do. So this is just an extra optional added attraction. And according to Porter, you can look at the nature of competitiveness in a given industry as a composite of 5 forces. And these forces are the threat of new entrants, the bargaining power of suppliers, the bargaining power of buyers, substitute power, and the degree of industry rivalry. And this whole analysis was designed to explain why certain industries are more profitable than others. And, for example, how come the prescription pharmaceutical and petroleum industries are consistently very profitable, but the agriculture and travel agency industries are less so? And what Porter found was that by using these 5 forces, he could consistently explain things like that. There's a nice little chart of it, the things we mentioned, all in the 5. You can see 5 things there. I won't dwell on it. Okay, well, let's look at some of these things one by one, looking back at each one of these to begin with. So, what are the factors affecting the threat of new entrants? And Porter says there are things like economies of scale. And perhaps the most obvious barrier to entering an industry is where there's a need for large-scale production in order to be cost-efficient. For example, the motor vehicle industry. And then you've got things like proprietary product differences. So this means that where existing products are unique in some way, and you can't replicate that uniqueness, because otherwise it wouldn't be unique, then it's difficult to enter the industry. And what happens in big pharma is that the the patents on the new medicine, prohibit competitors from using similar products for a long time. So, that has a massive effect on that. Okay, then we have brand identity, switching costs, and capital requirements. So maybe I'll go in fairly thorough detail through this one, and then we'll skip through the others, and you can research them yourselves if it's unclear, or ask me on the board. Okay. Well, brand identity relates to the case where if existing producers in that industry have established their brands, for example, Microsoft in the software industry, this can be a barrier to entry, because usually brand identity is related to proprietary product differences that have created the brand. So, going up against Microsoft that's a big ask. And then you have things like switching costs. So, I think that's fairly obvious. Changing your entire organization to a new industry. You have things like capital requirements, access to distribution, and so on. If we look at capital requirements, this could be related to the economies of scale argument, where if you need a high capital in order to enter the industry, then that'll probably limit the numbers. For example, the resources and chemical industries. And if you have a great idea, but you don't have that massive capital finance behind you, then you're probably not going to be able to break in. Okay. And carrying on with the factors affecting the threat of new entrants, we have access to distribution. So what does that mean? Well, if you have an inability to distribute a product, that can kill even the best products. For instance, independent movie producers find it difficult to get good access to the public because most movie theaters are controlled by a small number of chains like Hoyts, Grady Union, and so on. And they purchase direct from major US distributors, which is pretty tough for independent movie producers. Then you have things like absolute cost advantages. What we're talking about here is if existing organizations have these absolute cost advantages over the new entrants, they make it difficult to enter because they've built up those cost advantages through production experience. This has resulted in efficiencies that they've earned and learned the hard way, which are very difficult to replicate immediately. They have control over their cheap raw materials, or perhaps a low-cost design, operation, and distribution, something like production of computer chips. Now for that would be a difficult one to get into if there's an absolute cost advantage there. Then we've got government policy. Now, this can be a barrier in many small economy or developing countries, such as, say, India, perhaps even China. You look at airlines, post, radio, TV, telephones, energy, utilities, banking, education. They've either been government-owned or are highly regulated or have been highly regulated. And so this government policy on foreign investment can also prevent a foreign firm from entering the market in that case. And looking at finally at expected retaliation, this is perhaps one of the most important barriers to entry, is when the existing competitors retaliate. And retaliation by Qantas and Ansett, if any of you remember Ansett, in 2000 to the entry of Impulse and Virgin to the domestic airline industry, led to 2 of those 4 firms exiting the industry in 12 months, and fares were dramatically cut by all 4 competitors there. Okay. Well, the other one is we're moving on to another of Porter's things, which is the factors affecting the power of suppliers. So if we just skip back there, we are factors affecting the power of suppliers, which can be also called bargaining power of suppliers. So we've got things like, and I won't belabor them, but you can find it probably in that article which you've read, but differentiation of inputs, switching costs of suppliers and firms, the presence of substitute inputs, supplier concentration relative to industry concentration, and the importance of volume to suppliers. Maybe if we have a look at perhaps differentiation of inputs, just to clarify one of them, and otherwise this will be a very long session. So, okay, differentiation of inputs. If a supplier's input is crucial to the final product, that supplier will have power. So, for instance, when you're buying computer packages, customers tend to value the software more than the hardware. And because of this, the key software suppliers, like Microsoft, have been able to maintain their prices much better than the hardware suppliers. And the hardware suppliers' inputs are not perceived to be differentiated as much as they were. So that's an example of that one. Let's pick one more, say, looking at our options. What about threat of forward integration? So this relates to the fact that if suppliers are large organizations relative to those in the industry, and remember we're talking about suppliers here, and if suppliers have the power to enter the industry, then they'll have considerable power. For example, petrol refiners are able to operate their own petrol retailing outlets, and this gives them a role in setting the retail price benchmarks, and also provides them with information on the real cost structures of the retailer. So there's an example right there of that kind of thing. Okay, what about factors affecting the power of buyers? And in contrast, again, here you have the situation of the, just trying to pick one here, differentiation of outputs, switching cost of buyers. Let's look at a couple of those. Yeah, the bargaining power of buyers from the industry is really just a mirror image of the bargaining power of suppliers. And this time, the industry is the supplier, not the buyer, in the transaction. So, if we list the factors, which I've done there, and it's the reverse, essentially. One I want to look at in a little bit of detail is this one, the power of substitutes, the power of substitute products and services, and the products of different business or industries that can satisfy similar customer needs. And it's important to bear in mind here that, for example, I think it said somewhere in the learning materials that, Pepsi is not a substitute for Coke, perhaps orange juices, and similarly, perhaps coffee industry flavored milks might be a substitute as well. But that definition of substitute doesn't mean something identical in the same industry. And we look at the relative price performance of substitutes, the switching costs, and the buyer's propensity to substitute. So if we look at the relative price performance of substitutes, we find that all substitutes have a price and a performance level. If we take a look at the alcoholic beverage industry, for example, non-alcoholic beverages are substitutes. And if what is demanded of an alcoholic beverage is that the drinker become more relaxed, for example, then you compare the performance of, say, soft drink or water or coffee, it's not very good. However, if the performance demanded of the product is refreshment, then you could say that a non-alcoholic beverage may perform this function. And each substitute also has a price. And non-alcoholic stuff's quite cheap, so their price performance for refreshment is probably better than alcoholic beverages. However, it's less clear if alcoholic performance is demanded. You pay more for alcohol and it gives better performance. And as the price changes and the performance of substitutes changes, the threat of each substitute will also change. And switching cost refers to, how easy is it for buyers to switch from the industry product to a substitute. For example, most canned beer comes in aluminium cans. When aluminium costs went up, steel was more economical. But the switch didn't really happen because of the disruption and upheaval to purchasing relationships and production schedules and so on. So in that case, the switching costs were too high and people stuck with aluminium. All right, I'm going to move along without getting bogged down too much on any one of these. What about the factors affecting rivalry within the industry? Well, we have industry growth rate, high fixed costs, intermittent overcapacity, product differences, and brand identity. One that might be a little opaque is intermittent overcapacity. And what that refers to is that in some industries, capacity must be added in large lumps, for example, like the aluminium smelting industry. And they'll experience periods where demand often exceeds supply, and then they'll get an expansion of capacity of many competitors simultaneously. And they all see the excess demand, and they all decide to increase their capacity rather than lose market share. And this results in pretty severe rivalry during the period where supply exceeds demand. And the industry is characterized by periods of large profits and large losses. Let's have also a look perhaps at brand identity. If brands are important, it generally reflects perceived product differences between competitors, and this assists in reducing competition within the industry. There's more. On the same one, let's pick, say, informational complexity. So what we have here is if the products in the industry are complex, buyers will find it difficult to understand product differences because of the complexity of those products. And they may not be willing to invest the time to understand those differences. And that reduces rivalry. So, the classic example is Linux or Linux, whichever you prefer. It's free, it's a great operating system, open source, it does pretty much everything, but Microsoft's operating systems are still bought by the majority of businesses because they just don't really take the time or understand or get what Linux is or can do. Okay, what else have we got here? Yeah, look at one more. What about exit barriers? So if it's difficult or costly to withdraw from an industry, then competitors may decide to stay even if they're making losses. For example, BHP decided to withdraw from steel making because the returns were not satisfactory. And then it found it difficult to get a buyer for its plant. So rather than write off large amounts of investment, it kept operating at low levels of return rather than exit. And eventually it floated the operation as OneSteel, which is now called Arium. And the existing management took a significant stake. And, when we look at industry rivalry in a practical way, virtually every organization believes it faces intense or high rivalry. And apart from, that it's obvious that this is highly unlikely to be true from the law of averages, it is also clear that from this list of factors we've just looked at, that many industries do really genuinely face high rivalry. Now, when growth is high, products are differentiated and there are few competitors. It is unlikely that rivalry is really high. So be wary of simply assuming rivalry is high without doing a rigorous analysis. Okay, so let's sum it up. Each of the 5 forces should be summarized in terms of their impact on industry profitability. Look at the power of each force, high, average, or low. Just try and avoid playing it safe by just going down the middle with everything. Commit to your analysis. And also be aware that things change pretty fast these days, so be aware that it can be dynamic and things can change on you. So if you find that all the forces are rated high, then industry profit should be low, and vice versa. So have a look at the industry profitability data and see if it confirms your analysis. Also remember, profitability does vary within industries, depending on the company. Look at what's changing and consider future profitability as well when you draw your conclusions. So from these analysis you do, you can get out some key success factors, and these are the key, say, 3 to 6 factors organizations need to do well just to survive. Not to thrive, but just to survive. Examples could be marketing, product quality, customer service, price, technical expertise. Okay, so it begs the question, is this all really useful, this Porter's 5 forces stuff, or is it just something cooked up by some academic to force us to read long, boring articles, or is it useful? Well, it can be static if you only look at current positions. There's no real space in it for innovation and change, which is pretty dangerous these days. And you can apply it to the industry level, but the factors may not apply at all at the organizational level. And some authors like Hubbard have suggested some changes to the model, keep the base model and brush it up a bit to account for this. Well, let's do a very quick and dirty case study on the global pharmaceutical drug industry to give you a rough idea. Let's say we call 5 the strongest and 1 the weakest. Let's look at one of the forces, threat of entry. Give it a weighting of 3. There are high capital requirements, and the average drug requires about $200 million in R&D and substantial unrecoverable marketing expenditures. So a niche strategy would only be a feasible basis of competition for new entrants that really are frequently subject to aggressive takeover overtures. And you need high specialized expertise to successfully participate when you're talking about the research and the qualifications involved in making these drugs. And also there's patent protection, which promotes and protects innovation. So if people are innovating, you've got to keep up. All right, what about threat of substitutes? Given a weighting of 2 here. And remember, just going back as a reminder, 5 is the strongest and 1 is the weakest. So not very. And few substitutes exist for drug therapy. There was a case recently where South Africa was selling AIDS medication in a much cheaper, unbranded version that was, for all intents and purposes, identical. And they got taken to international court over it because the pharmaceutical companies were not happy with that. But generally speaking, there are few substitutes. And pharmaceuticals are cheaper than hands-on medical and surgical interventions, obviously. And these generic products are only available after a lengthy period of patent protection. And so, again, reduces the threat of substitutes. And other forms of therapy are less trusted and typically arguably more risky. What about the bargaining power of buyers? Well, we have again a low rating of 1 to 2. And the reason doctors and not patients usually make the purchase decision based on the product attributes and efficacy, not the price, although, having said that, studies do show doctors are the single most susceptible profession to subliminal advertising, and there's an enormous amount of pressure on them to, dare I say, sell certain drugs. So there's a bit more to that one. And when consumers do make the purchase decision, they show a high brand loyalty, and that tends to work against private label drugs. There's also some organized buying groups like health maintenance organizations, provincial healthcare providers, and they've to a degree eroded the discretionary powers of the manufacturers. And let's look at the bargaining power of the suppliers. Again, low 2. And many of the raw inputs to pharmaceuticals are actually commodities. Biotech and gene therapy are still developmental, so not too much of a worry there. And because of their massive amount of capital involved in big pharma, many of the new biotech companies will just be acquired and put to bed, and that threat is removed. Also, it's difficult to acquire the highly specialized human resources in some pharmaceutical therapy areas. They are highly qualified, and it's hard to find such people. Right, degree of competitive rivalry, we're moving up to 3 here. We do have continual product innovation by rivals, which can create new or growing demand. The aging of the baby boomers and growing lifespans will mean pharmaceuticals are on the up and up, and they all want to feel good, even if they're 100. And a high percentage of unrecoverable costs such as R&D and marketing will increase the barriers to exit. And we also have the offsetting of the effect of high premiums offered by incumbents for acquisitions of smaller companies. So the smaller companies just tend to get gobbled up rather than become competitors. Okay, so if we're looking at big pharma again, all of the competitive forces now facing this industry are fairly weak to moderate. I think the highest score was 3. The attractiveness of it remains good. Profitability of rivals is relatively high, and we need to consider carefully the existing and potential trends that could impact here. And it may be that in the future, attractiveness and profitability may be relatively harder to achieve in future years. So there's a little graphic of Porter's 5 forces: bargaining power of suppliers, bargaining power of customers, mirror image basically, threat of substitutes, threat of new entrants, and then the 5th, competitive rivalry within an industry. And that's it. So I hope to some extent that's been of interest and assisted you with your understanding of Porter's 5 forces, or maybe just made a small change from reading, getting to listen for a change instead of reading. And thanks very much, and thank you to everyone who's listening who's posted stuff on the board. That's great and much appreciated. Keep up the great work, and I will see you all on the discussion board. So thanks again, and bye for now.